After retirement as service chief of Animal Center, James decided not to return to live in the city and sold the apartment he owned there. And then he moved to a small village in the Taiga area located in the middle of large and beautiful forests, and there bought a small house surrounded by a large field. He spent a lot of money on renovations, but he came to regard it as a place where he would spend the rest of his life. And he deserved to spend all his money and care for his beloved animals as a free man. But he had a little secret that no one in this village knew about. James spent 2 years behind bars after killing a thief in his apartment. The people of the village didn't know that James had just come out of prison, and the man didn't want to tell anyone his story because he realized that people would judge him. In addition, they'll refuse to coexist with him, especially since the residents of the village are known to avoid contact with strangers or someone who has a bad history. James found everything he wished for in his house. Isolated from the village and close to the forest, the place is quiet and beautiful and far from the noise of the village, and the surrounding forest is wonderful. He has a beautiful animal that he spends most of his time with. James bought all the supplies that he would need for several months without going to the store and decided that he would spend the harsh winter alone at home. And he was fortunate that he did that because the winter that year was very harsh and the snow was thick and prevented people from moving about freely. The man had everything, firewood, food, and gasoline to light the stove, so he didn't care what was happening outside. When he noticed that leaving the house was not possible, he spent his days reading books and looking out into the woods from behind the window panes of his room. One day, James took his hunting rifle and wandered into the woods. The snow was high and the road was closed, which made him think of returning home minutes after entering the forest. But suddenly, he heard a continuous howling of tigers. Then he started tiptoeing and listening intently to discover the source of that howl. He was walking very carefully because he knew that the tigers were hungry and would not hesitate to attack him. The sound was coming from outside the woods, and more precisely, from a field near a large deserted wooden house that belonged to an old farmer who had died last year, leaving it empty ever since then. A man saw a group of tigers gathered near an old tractor belonging to the owner of the farm, screaming with their whole soul. Then he approached quietly and hid behind the wall of the house and continued watching from a distance. He saw 3 tigers surrounding a tigress that was lying on the ground and protecting her because the tigress was pregnant and about to give birth, but she was suffering a lot. The man was astonished when he saw the tigress, and he began to wonder about the reason for these tigers wrapping around her. He continued to wait for those tigers to leave in order to approach her and discover what exactly was happening with this poor animal. As soon as those tigers disappeared, the man approached the tigress and found out that it was dead while its stomach was swollen. He confirmed that when he found out it was not breathing and that its limbs were completely frozen. James didn't understand the cause of the tigress's death, and he had regrets about her condition. In the end, he decided to bury her. But suddenly, he felt something that was moving in her stomach. And then he began to gently touch and make sure that the tigress was indeed pregnant before death. The man realized that her babies were still alive, and he thought of a way to help them so that he might help their mother's soul in a different way. James brought the knife out of the aid bag he took with him everywhere, and he began to slash the tigress's belly with tears in his eyes. When he finished, the cubs appeared, moving with difficulty and hardly breathing. The man had to deal with it quickly because it was so cold, and those little cubs would definitely need heating, milk, and veterinarian care at an animal care center in order to survive. At first, he tried to sneak into the deserted house and put the little cubs there while he buried the mother, but he found that its doors and windows were tightly closed. Then he realized that he had no other choice but to take the cubs home with him to be treated, and he called 2 other friends who worked together in animal medical care. They were totally surprised when they found out how he saved these cubs while he had left their mother in the same place. James carried the little cubs in his hands and bade farewell to the mother tigress while shedding tears. Then, he carried his rifle in his bag and quickly returned home. There, he put the tigress's babies on a mattress near the stove, and his friend gave him special milk that he'd brought them. Then, began to check them and make sure that they were safe now. The man had no idea how to deal with little cubs, but with his friend's experience with tigers, everything could be okay, because even though he spent most of his life in the city with domestic animals, he was aware that milk was necessary for the baby tigers. So he gave it to them and asked what he should do with those cubs to save their lives. The following week, he visited the veterinarian center after his friends went back to the city again and told him what had happened to him the week before. Then the veterinarian gave him some vitamins and recommended that he buy some food from the animal shop and give it to the 4 little cubs. He also advised him to keep them near the stove in the early days so that they wouldn't get cold, and asked him to tell him if he noticed their condition was worsening. James was getting old, and he forgot sometimes, so this veterinarian was constantly visiting to check up with the cubs and see their weight as usual, advising him that he shouldn't keep them, not like other animals that he used to care about. James took care of the newborn tiger cubs in his house, watching them all the time, bringing them food and water, and following the vet's instructions. And with the passage of days, they began to grow and became able to walk around the house. They were so young, beautiful, and fun that James would stay with them all day without getting bored, treating them like a domestic animal. Small animals contributed to improving his mood because the man lived alone and didn't find anyone to stay with for a long time. One day, a man came on a tractor and asked James if he could help him get those cubs because he had heard that he had found them inside his grandfather's farm. However, the man refused and stated that he would not let the tigers go anywhere because he pledged himself that he would return them to the forest when the winter ended, and he noticed that they were able to take care of themselves too. The man left furious and wanted to take revenge on James. It turned out that this same man had escaped from prison several weeks ago and was also the grandson of the farmer who died and left the house in which James found the pregnant tigress. The man, called Andre, wanted to get these cubs in order to sell them to people who buy small wild animals at very high prices. He was a very dangerous man who gets everything he wants, regardless of the price. The man discovered that some hunters who passed near his house every day in order to enter the forest noticed the presence of tigers running in the yard of his house. Then the news spread, and it reached the criminal Andre, and the latter knew that James had found the cubs on his grandfather's farm and insisted on getting them back as his own property. James kept an eye on the poor tigers, and he used to stay next to them all day. But on one early morning, 3 men came and knocked on the door. As soon as the man opened the door, he began to ask the strangers about the reason for knocking on the door so early. However, suddenly someone hit him. It was Andre with a stick he was holding in his hands, and he dropped him on the ground. The men took James inside, grabbed the 4 cubs, put them in their bags, and left. When the man woke up from this attack, he didn't find the small animals in his house, which put him in great despair. James immediately went out to the village and began to ask about the identity of these people, but everyone was afraid to tell him because they feared Andre. But an old man told him that it was the bad man, Andre, and his gang, and gave him the address of the place where he had hidden the stolen cubs. James was preparing his tools during the snowstorm that day and went to the hut in which Andre and his men were hiding the cubs, as well as other animals that they illegally hunted and stole from the villagers. And there, he found Andre and his gang sitting in a small corner inside the hut, drinking wine and laughing. The man quietly crept into the hut and found the 4 baby tigers and 2 other tigers inside cages. Then he broke the cells and removed the 4 tigers, then opened the door of the cage with the 2 tigers, and then took all the animals to the forest and released them. He returned home, proud of everything he had done. The next day, James went to the police station and complained about the man who escaped from prison and reported the crimes he committed against the villagers. Andre was arrested as a fugitive in the woods and transferred to jail along with his friends. The lesson is that these animals should be left in the wild in their native territories. The only time these animals should be in captivity is if they've been injured and are not able to be released in the wild.